few more seconds here and we'll get started. Okay, thanks everybody for joining. I'm so excited to have you here today for our session on food safety at your nonprofit organization. A really big topic that's very important to Second Harvest. So to get started, I'll just do some introductions quickly. My name's Veronica Summerhill. I am the Director of Product at Second Harvest, and I will admit I'm a self-proclaimed food safety nerd. So I'm very excited, extra excited for this, and I hope you'll enjoy the session. As well, we have with us today Emily Krause, our Community Success Coordinator. Many of you probably are familiar with Emily. She is instrumental in answering all of your technical questions, any support that you're looking for on the technology side. And she works a lot behind the scenes to make the app all operate smoothly for the Second Harvest Food Rescue app. So we're both very excited to be here today. So to begin, I would love to start with a land acknowledgement. So while we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. Please join me in acknowledging the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we may each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to share my PowerPoint here. And go full screen. It will let me. Emily, just confirming everybody can just see the full screen.
We can see your notes there, Veronica.
That's not great, is it? Sorry, folks. First technical difficulties. Ooh, it does not like this. Oh no, it's very nerve-wracking. What?
Hey, Tracy, did you have a question there? You can put it in the Q&A there. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can put those right into the Q&A.
Sorry, everybody. I am having a hard time here. I'm going to just share my full screen and hope this works. Come on. Emily.
Display settings in the top there.
Hold on. I don't think I can see it because it's covered by the mute or the thin. There we go.
Yeah, swap the. There
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry,
yeah.
That's a real panic moment. Okay, back to regularly scheduled programming. I'm sorry, all. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. There will be about 45 minutes of content. If you do have any questions at all, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. So that you can see this, I have at the bottom of the screen there an indication that shows you how to find the Q&A feature. You're welcome to use the chat to chat between yourselves, share ideas, whatever you'd like. But if there are specific questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end. Or if there's something Emily can answer throughout, she may be able to get to that. We will start with we'll have a very, very quick poll at the beginning and the end just to assess our learnings for Second Harvest. That's a really important part of conducting any webinars is knowing how we did. And just please note that we are recording this webinar. So it will be available afterwards as well. And for all of the participants, you are muted and your video is off. But as I mentioned, you can share anything you'd like in the chat, or if you have questions in the Q&A. So to get us started, we have our first poll very quickly. I don't see it, Emily. You.
I just launched it there, yeah.
Thank you. So yes, we'd just like to know before attending the session, let us know sort of what you think your food safety knowledge is, and how practiced you are in food safety. Just to let everybody know, we'll just give it a few more seconds. But thank you for letting us know. It looks like lots of people are saying they have a good handle on food safety, but we're seeing folks from all across the board. Some excellent, 12% are excellent. That's fantastic. You probably have something to teach me. So if you do, please share afterwards. But fantastic. We'll just give it 5 more seconds here, and then we'll close out the poll. Perfect. All right. So you can see the results there. Lots of folks who said they had a good understanding. So hopefully this is just a nice refresher for you. Just to review, the topics we'll be going over today is how to build a food safety culture and why you should build one. Looking at food safety and bacteria, what do those things mean together? Our 4 steps to food safety, because we like to keep it really simple for you, and then food date labels in Canada. So to get started here, we're going to talk about food safety culture. So I just want to take a moment to say, a lot of people don't find food safety very interesting. And while I do maybe understand that, I completely disagree with them. Food safety is such an exciting topic. And for all of you guys out there who are operating organizations that rely on food or even serve food from time to time, food safety is not only just so important in the work that you do, it's an amazing way to show your clients, the people that you work with, how much you care about them, how dedicated you are to their supports. Because of course, serving food safely is serving food, with dignity. It's serving people with dignity. And so of course, it's so important. And I think when we think about it that way, it's a great way to energize ourselves about food safety. But food safety, it's something you can attend this webinar, you can learn about it or refresh yourself for an hour. But what really matters is going back and working that into your day-to-day, of everything that you do at your organization. So we like to think of building food safety into your organization as a culture. I think thinking about it that way can really help you to just sort of embed it in a very simple way where it doesn't feel like a chore, because often we do hear that it's something that you can do, just how you do your business. And I just invite you guys, feel free to throw it in the chat very quickly, to think about or let us know what are the food safety pieces that your organization does well, and maybe where are places you may need to improve. And is maybe just building it more into your culture and into your everyday work, a place where you may need to improve. So feel free to put it in the chat. It's always good to get conversations going. But I do like to start off with that idea of food safety being a culture, so that we embed it in the work that we do, and it's not a chore on top of everything else we're doing. It's a way to look at serving our clients or users with the best way we can. Sorry, my keyboard is not. So very interestingly, when we talk food safety, we of course care about feeding everybody safely. That's important. Nobody should really be treated with more or less care. But the reality is there are certain people who are much more susceptible to potentially getting ill, who we really need to be extra considerate of for how we're operating. And we call these high-risk populations. You guys are probably very familiar with this concept. The idea of infants and young children, pregnant women, elderly people, people with weakened immune systems, or people even taking certain medications. These are all people who have much higher chance of either getting sick or having detrimental effects when they are sick. And so when we're talking about food safety, we're often thinking extra about these high-risk populations. Well, coincidentally, the high-risk populations are often in the nonprofit sector who we're targeting to serve. So just another sort of concept and idea to share that, the importance of food safety in everything we do is so high. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, and you guys are well aware of, the great care you take with your at-risk populations. Something I really like to spell out, and again, this may be very, very obvious to folks, but in the case that this concept is new to people, or just as a reminder to us, why are we talking about food safety? What specifically are we talking about? When we're talking about food safety, we are talking about a lot of things, making sure there's not glass in food, chemicals, these different things. But primarily what we're talking about is preventing people from getting sick from eating the food, in what we would call preventing food poisoning, making sure people don't get sick when they eat the food. Now, the reason someone would get food poisoning is because the food that we were handling grew bacteria. And bacteria grows based on the way food's treated. It's all over, it's in the air, it's on our clothes, it's everywhere. So, it's not a matter of having no bacteria, it's a matter of handling the food safely so that bacteria doesn't both get onto the food and even then grow on the food. Because I like to remind people, one bacterium may not make you sick, but 100 may. And so, as you give it time to grow in the conditions that it likes, that's when we have issues. Now, I promise I won't get much more scientific than that. That just gives us a sort of idea of what we're talking about and why we're talking about food safety. Because if you're like me, you always like to know why and, ask those questions. So by preventing the growth of bacteria, we're preventing the chance that someone will get sick from food poisoning. So going into for the 4 steps to food safety. So, there's so much we could learn and so many different skills and tools in your toolbox for how to manage food and safely handle food. Now, of course, there is a full day safe food handler training session that you can get certified with the government. And this is by no means meant to replace that. All the information here is aligned with that. I am certified to teach that, so I'm well versed. But we are offering the opportunity for just like a simple refresher on food safety for our nonprofits. So we've condensed all of that amazing 8 hours of content into 4 key learnings. And we'll go through those 4 steps to food safety. The first one, this one makes me laugh a little bit because it seems so obvious at times, but it's still, so important. It's really this simple to keep food safe because we have to keep things clean. Again, I don't mean to make it this simple, but it really is this simple. And first thing is personal hygiene. So, I mentioned that bacteria and viruses, it is everywhere. It's on our bodies, it's on our hands, hair, clothes, everything. So what's really important is, of course, personal hygiene, so easy to achieve, but then a reminder, if you're out there in your programs, you may be out in the garden, or you may be working with small children and getting dirty, having, maybe not these days, but in regular days, having kids sort of climbing all over you, whatnot. Anytime you're in a situation like that, it's really, really good to be mindful when you are going to a food prep scenario. You are, of course, washing your hands, something we've all become very good at over the past year and a bit. But you're also just thinking of your clothes and your hair. Are you able to, put a little apron on to protect, the food from potentially coming in contact with your clothes and, your hair and whatnot. So very simple, it says showering daily here. It kind of makes me laugh because it's so simple, but truly it's that easy. And it's really important part of keeping food safe. Another one, no surprise here, I won't spend much time on it. As I mentioned, we've all gotten so great at it over the past year, is washing our hands. And really, you know, anytime you're changing work that you're doing, so whether you're working with your clients and then moving to food, or you're changing different types of food, you're working with chicken and then over to vegetables. I mean, it's quite obvious, but always washing our hands between these steps. Now, here's where we start to get a little less obvious. So this is the fun stuff. When we say keep it clean, we're talking about clean and sanitized. Now, usually in an in-person version of this, I would ask people what the difference is, but because we don't have that opportunity right now, I'll just let you know. Clean is when you look at something and you don't see any dirt on it. You don't see stains, you don't see, you know, there's not food spilled anywhere. You can see in that kitchen, it looks very clean. It's beautiful. It's nice and shiny, all is well. I don't expect that this is a kitchen that you guys too many of our nonprofit partners are working in, probably don't look anything like that industrial kitchen, but it gives you a good idea there. Now, just because it looks clean doesn't mean it is clean, because the one thing we all know about bacteria and viruses these days is we cannot see them. So while something may be visually clean, free from dirt, it actually may be unsanitary or not sanitized, meaning that there's harmful levels of, when we say contamination, bacteria, viruses living on the surface of things. And so this little diagram just indicates, while something may be visually clean, there's also the potential for bacteria to be growing on something. And that's where we need to consider the step of not only cleaning, but sanitizing. So sanitizing is making sure the levels of bacteria growing on surface or whatever we're talking about are reduced to a safe number. It's 99.9%. I said no science, so I will stop there. So when we talk about sanitizing, it's very, very simple. You guys are probably really familiar with this idea, is using chlorine, using bleach. There are 2 other approved chemical sanitizers in Canada: iodine, which is very messy; quaternary ammonium, which is, again, more scientific, not for the everyday user. But sanitizing, and by all means, you're able to use them, you're welcome to use them, but I always recommend bleach distilled to the right amount of bleach versus water. And that will always just depend on the product you buy, so you can just read the label. And so whether you're talking about sanitizing a surface, maybe it's a table that you want to work on, or maybe your cutlery that you're going to use to serve food. In Canada, when you are serving food, you in both the workspaces and any of the cutlery, the dishware, whatnot, you need to clean and then you need to sanitize. So sanitizing, very simple. You put that, as I mentioned, that great ratio of bleach or chlorine or whatever other chemical sanitizer you're using and water. Make sure the ratio is right. You have to use the correct water temperature. Too hot, too cold, the sanitizing doesn't work. That will be 45 degrees Celsius. Now, I don't expect you to take a thermometer to it, although if you have one and you like to do that, that's great. But, you know, a really warm water, close to hot, but not quite hot, maybe, is a good way to describe that. And then you need to at least typically let that sanitizer touch that surface, touch those dishes or whatnot for 2 minutes. So you need to consider these 3 items here: the amount, the water temperature, and the time. Sounds very fancy, I know. Sounds annoying and complicated, perhaps, but you know, once you build it into your routine, into your food safety culture, then you know it's no sweat on that. So going through here, this is a different way of looking at that process. As I mentioned, whether you're talking about your a surface that you're working on or your dishes, you're always going to wash. And this shows us in a sink. You're going to wash in the first sink. You're going to rinse things out. If you don't have 3 sinks, which most folks at nonprofits don't, you actually rinse over your washing sink just with running water from your tap. And then in your second sink, you're sanitizing for you know, at least 45 degrees water. It says here 45 seconds. 2 minutes is my go-to. But yes, making sure you leave it there for extra time. And then good tip or trick is, if you do need to dry your dishes, well, it's not a tip or trick. The sort of standard requirement in Canada is that all of your drying happens by air, that you're not drying with towels. And again, understanding this probably doesn't happen at a lot of nonprofits. Sometimes you're working in spaces that are not permanent for you, and you may need to, get out of there after the end of your day. But that is the standard in Canada. And the requirement is to always let things air dry, because if you're drying with a damp towel, bacteria love damp, and you may just be getting things dirty all over again. So can you tell I'm very excited and I love food safety? We've got through step one and you guys are loving it. I know you are. It's fun stuff. So on to step two. Step two is all about storage. We need to consider how food is stored, both like in transit and in, when we get to our facility. And there's a very, very, very easy trick to do that. We always say, keep hot food hot and cold food cold. So what I mean by this is if you have food that is heated, you're serving a lasagna, you're serving a curry, whatever you're serving, and it's prepared food, it's heated. Even when you're serving it, by standard in Canada, that food should be 60 degrees or higher. So the way you would keep that is potentially, if it's something, keeping it on the stove. If it's something, in a pot, keeping it on the stove. If it's something that's maybe in a dish, keeping it in the oven. Now, of course, you can take it out to serve, but if you are spending more than a little bit of time with that food, you need to keep it above 60 degrees. So you'll need to keep it, find a way to keep it warm. Now, why I say 60 degrees is because there's this concept of the temperature danger zone. This is between 4 degrees and 60 degrees Celsius, or 40 Fahrenheit and 140 Fahrenheit. And I apologize, I speak Celsius. I don't apologize, we are in Canada. But yes, for those of you who may be more familiar with Fahrenheit, I've just tried to put them in the slides because I don't always know specifically those numbers. But for the temperature danger zone, this is where bacteria grows very rapidly. And as I mentioned earlier, when bacteria grows, more bacteria on food could mean more likely that we are going to get sick. So bacteria only grows in the middle range. So we can either keep something hot to make sure bacteria is not growing, or keep it cold to make sure bacteria is not growing. This is why we have ovens and fridges and freezers. It sounds very obvious now that I say it that way, of course, but just to bring it back home to what we're really trying to achieve here, what we're doing is either keeping the food hot, as I mentioned, when we're serving it, or most of the time, we're keeping food cold. Now, of course, and this is in the fridge or potentially in the freezer. Now, of course, you're asking or thinking to yourself, what about shelf-stable foods? What about, yes, of course, those can go on the shelf. They don't need to be kept hot or cold. When I am talking about foods that need to stay out of the temperature danger zone, I'm talking about those foods that we traditionally think of as perishable, or we call them potentially hazardous, slightly different than perishable. But long story short, anything prepared food, meat, dairy, eggs, and soy, and frozen product. And that's all the stuff that you're really going to want to be mindful of, keeping it hot or cold. One thing that's really important to note is, as I mentioned, as you're serving something or whatnot, you may have to take it out of that temperature. You want to serve something, from the fridge, you have to take it out of the fridge to serve it. That's no problem, of course. But what you have to be mindful of is that these foods, these perishable foods, can't be in the temperature danger zone for more than 2 hours. Now, the rule does differ across Canada. Some places it's 2, some places it's 4. So we teach 2 because it's the lowest common denominator. But ultimately, making sure that if you are taking that food out of the fridge or you're taking it off the heat, that it only spends a maximum of 2 hours outside of that temperature, outside of the cold or the hot. And then at that point, you either make sure it's put away or, it's all used up and it's hopefully you have one or the other, because as you know, at Second Harvest, we like to make sure no food is disposed of, because that would be option 3, and we don't want to do that. So just a very, very quick, I will say, not too hi-fi, but very useful sort of animation of how bacteria grows based on the time. So you'll see here, as time passes, we have 4.5 hours passing, bacteria doubles, and we get to over 1 million bacteria. So here we go for my very hi-fi animation. So as I said, this is real. This is based on scientific data. After 4.5 hours, you go from 1 bacterium to over 1 million bacteria. So this is why food has to stay out of that temperature danger zone. And this is specifically when food's sitting in the temperature danger zone, not if it's in the fridge or freezer or hot. So back to our storage overall. Next concept is just using this idea of FIFO. Folks may be familiar with this from other industries. It stands for first in, first out, but the very basic idea of it is stock rotation. Always using the oldest product you have first. So if I have milk that I bought 1 week ago and 2 weeks ago, I'm going to use the milk I bought 2 weeks ago first to try to keep managing that stock. And really this is, of course, for safety and also to reduce any potential loss. So that you're able to, not have to throw food away and sort of waste that money or opportunity. Step 4, 3. I think we got off track. They're out of order here. I apologize, but the next step is to keep food separate. So this concept of cross-contamination is a really important concept. No, it is 4. Sorry, I'm so excited. I'm going fast and I forgot what step we were on. A really important concept. It sounds complicated, but it's not. The term cross-contamination really just means one item transferring any bacteria, living bacteria or other harmful substances to another item. So if I'm a person preparing food and I've been playing in the garden and I have dirt all over me, dirt has E. coli in it, then I lean up against my counter where I'm preparing food. That's when I can transfer bacteria between people to surfaces. So this is our idea that we're always thinking about when we say keep it separate as the 4th step, is preventing cross-contamination, keeping things organized and separated so that you can make sure that if something is potentially has bacteria on it, that it doesn't come into contact with other things and spread. I love this picture because it always makes people cringe. And that probably says a lot about me, but I will say this is an uncomfortable picture for a reason. We all know that a raw chicken should not be sitting beside some lettuce and raw vegetables, of course. But this is a sort of more obvious option or instance of cross-contamination, but there are lots, that we can think about. I gave the example of my clothes and the table, but also, your hands and touching food, or if you have worked with a certain type of food, maybe chicken or eggs or meat, and then you're touching other foods. That would be a good example. Really important in your fridge, if at all possible, is keeping all the raw food on the bottom. Sorry, I got mixed up there, with the ready-to-eat foods on the top so that the raw food doesn't potentially drip on the ready-to-eat foods. And then, of course, you want to clean and sanitize all of your surfaces. This is another maybe obvious one and kind of makes me laugh a little bit funny, but thinking about how we're holding dishes and utensils. Well, dishes and utensils aren't food themselves. We do use these to eat. We touch them with our mouths, and what's on the dishes can come into our mouth and therefore make us sick. So just being mindful of how we're handling dishes as much as how we're handling food. And so, you know, some good examples here of things to do and not to do. Don't stick your fingers in all the glasses or hold them by the rim. As I said, it does sound kind of funny, but it is important to identify. And if you, even when you're serving food or handling dishes, hand washing is a really important step. I was right. This is step 4. I'm all mixed up because I'm just so excited. I apologize. So the last step of the 4 steps of food safety in our little package we have is cooking and cooling. Now, we talked a lot about the temperature danger zone. That's for when you are managing food overall, but for different, especially sort of dangerous foods, the perishable items, you do have to cook them to set temperatures based on Canadian standards. So in Canada, we say a whole poultry, whether it's a whole chicken or a turkey, it has to be cooked to 82 degrees versus if it's cut up into pieces, that's 74 and so on there. This is something that you can easily look up. I don't typically ask people memorize it. If they'd like to, that's great. But a great option is to just have it posted in your food prep area if you are preparing food at your organization, just so you can tell. Now, of course, I say cook, you know, let's say I'm cooking fish to 70 degrees. That's all well and good, but how do you know it's 70 degrees? Well, there's no secret to that. I think sometimes people hope there is, but the option is really to take the temperature of that food, and you're using a probe thermometer like the one you see here. Now for this, it's just, in this case, I have the picture showing how to calibrate your thermometer, but in checking the temperature of your food, you're sticking that thermometer into the product. If you are talking about meats, as most of those examples are, you're just making sure it's not touching any bones. It's more in the middle of the flesh. Now, using a thermometer is really important. It's definitely the piece I would say that gets overlooked the most. And it's key when you are in food preparation. If you're more of like a food bank or a hamper program, you may not have thermometers in because you're not cooking food, but really important to always have them in your fridges as well, because if your fridges aren't operating properly, you'll be able to identify that and make sure that they're, you know, keeping the food below 4 degrees. A fridge thermometer would look slightly different. It doesn't have the needle. It's more of like maybe a round or rectangular shape that just sits in your fridge and freezer. So thermometers are for everyone is the lesson there. But what's really important about your thermometer is to make sure it's actually measuring properly. So really, really easy way to do this. All probe thermometers have just a little dial that you can turn to match what the temperature should be. So you know ice is frozen. Stick the thermometer in ice with a little bit of water, let it settle, and so that the needle's not moving. And then turn the thermometer dial so that it shows the needle lines up with 0 degrees. Again, one of those pieces that you go, oh, Veronica, do I really have to do this? According to the Canada standards, yes, because we can't see temperature, as I said, and we do need to measure it. But, you know, getting in the habit, finding somebody in your organization who's as excited as me about food safety, not sure you will find somebody, but you could try, and assign this to them, give them that autonomy to do things and start to build some of these practices into the work that you're doing. And according to the book, you need to do the calibration, you know, once a day, but I'll give you once a week, you know, something like that, just something that you can check in on from time to time and make sure you're not totally off track. Now, interestingly, we talk about the temperature danger zone and we talk about how food can only stay there for 2 hours. Now, if I cooked a giant batch of something, and again, this is applicable only to those who are cooking, but if I'm cooking a giant batch of something and I take that off the heat and I'm done cooking it, it's going to take far more than 2 hours to go from that 60 degrees all the way through the temperature danger zone down to 4 degrees, my fridge temperature. So what I need to be really mindful of and what I need to be doing is as soon as I'm done cooking it, break that out into smaller containers so that has the opportunity to cool faster, like sort of the examples that you see here. There are other options. You can use things that are more technical that you don't see a lot, even in food service, like an ice wand or things like that. But that's really, really the easiest option, is to get that food out of the temperature danger zone, well, through the temperature danger zone from hot all the way down to cold at 4 degrees. You could also do what we see here in this picture, which is to take the pan or the pot and put it in a bigger pot with ice water around it, an ice bath. That will help cool it down faster as well. I would say cooling and thawing are some of the biggest places where people sort of neglect to keep the food safe. Of course, it will get through to the safe temperature, but by the time it does that, it may have taken 6 to 8 hours, and you've had too much bacteria growth at that time. And just keeping the foods even stirred every once in a while can really help you as well. And then, yeah, trying not to cover your food before it's cooled. Otherwise, you're sort of trapping heat in and it will take longer to cool. Now, I just mentioned the last piece here, which is thawing. So now this one, I think, is, you know, what we do at home may not be the same as what we should be doing at our organization, and that's okay. That's an important difference to recognize overall, is while the food safety laws in Canada exist and they need to be implemented across organizations, anybody serving food to the public, that's because the safety is, you're taking on the responsibility for somebody else's safety, where you're preparing food for them. You know, at home, if you want to prepare food differently or handle things differently, and we know lots of folks do, that's totally, you know, up to the discretion of you and your home, because you're making those decisions for yourself. But when thawing food in any food service operation, including nonprofits, there's only 4 ways to thaw food. And none of them, you'll notice, is just having it on the counter. I mean, it goes without saying probably at this point, but that's where the food would just be sitting in the temperature danger zone. And especially when we're talking about meat products or prepared foods, things that are high, that bacteria really like, this would not be a safe option. So instead, the best way, the easiest way, is to thaw in the refrigerator. You could also thaw under cold running water, but that is kind of challenging. You have stuff splashing everywhere. It makes a bit of a mess. You could thaw in the microwave as long as you are able to directly cook the product after that. Reason being, you've sort of already started the cooking process if you've put food in the microwave, and so you need to finish that at that time. Or of course, you could do it during cooking, like in the example of like a frozen lasagna is a good example of that. Now, on to the last item for today, which is date labeling, a topic that's pretty near and dear to our hearts at Second Harvest. So just some key information about date labeling in Canada. So manufacturers, the people making the food, the companies making the food, give products a best before date, and they really give a conservative best before date to uphold quality perception, so that whenever you open the product, based on the date, you never open it and go, oh, it's a little bit stale, or oh, it's not, you know, looks slightly dull in color, that you're opening that product and you're having a good experience about that product. Important point number 2 is there are no government regulations about food date labeling in Canada. So manufacturers, they have to put a date on, that's required in certain types of food, but it's totally up to them how they evaluate that date. And a lot of the time, of course, they're putting an earlier date, one, as I mentioned, for quality perception, but also so that if it does pass that date, you're more likely to throw it out and go buy more of their product. And so item number 3, this leads us to a really important point, is that consumers, all of us, typically tend to think that a best before date is an expiry date. And therefore they assume that once that date has passed, that best before date has passed, the food is no longer safe to consume. So we are going to dispel those myths together, in a moment. At the top of the webinar, I did ask if you had a moment or you were in a space where you could grab a prepared food product, to feel free to go grab one. I'll give everybody another quick 30 seconds now, because I think it's really important to actually work through this yourself and see and go through the food date label experience and learning together. So feel free, go grab one. I'll have a sip of water. We'll give everybody 30 seconds here, and we'll regroup. And I did notice while we're doing that, a few folks raising their hand. We'll take questions at the end. Do put them just in the Q&A session, Q&A section, I should say, in the Zoom tool.
Veronica, we did have a lot of folks asking if the slides would be available. Maybe while people are getting their item, we can respond to that quickly.
For sure, yes, absolutely. We can send the slides to all participants as well. You'll automatically get a recording of the session. But I do have some other amazing resources that I will share at the end. We have an interactive 15-minute training. It's, it has quizzes, it's online, it has a video. So it's really a beautiful training on food safety that pretty much covers these same topics here in a different way. So on top of the slides, yes, which will absolutely be available. I'll point you guys to that training, because I do think it's a great way to, as I said, promote food safety within your organization. You could take it as many times as you like. A great tool for learning there. So now that everybody's ran and gotten their food, and I'm sure you were just so excited, I'd ask you to take a look at that packaged food. If it's not packaged, and because I didn't say that this time, I now realize, take a look and see if you can find a date code on the package. Do you see a date on the package? And if so, where is it? Is it easy to find? Is it more difficult to find? And then in the chat, I'd like you to write whether, what the date says, or whether you think you found an expiry date or a best before date. So I'll open up the chat here and see what folks are seeing. We have David saying BB/MA 2024. A best before date. We have folks, lots of French, some bilingual. Well, you guys are amazing. You're all participating. That's always so nice. Crackers have a best before date. Lots of folks seeing BB/MA. Oh, I love this one. Best if used by. A little bit different than the BB or best before. We say best if used by. Which I will share with you guys now. That means the exact same thing. It's just a fancy way of saying it. You guys are amazing. You guys are all doing this. I thank you for your interactive and playing along here. So this is fantastic. What we're seeing, and you guys can see it if you open the chat, scroll back up, there is a wide range of what is written on products. Some say BB, some say BB/MA. The dates sometimes say it in writing. Sometimes it just says the year. Sometimes it just says the numbers like 02/03. Sometimes it has, the month is, in this case, we have Fiber 1, 04, OC 2024. All different ways that the dates are labeled. So I will go here to our next slide. Oops. And so I'll go into this. So we did talk about there's no regulations for best before dates on both how long in advance the best before date should be set based on the product, as well as what it says on the label. You saw in that chat all different examples of how the date is written, what it said specifically. And as I mentioned, these are just dates given by the manufacturer, and they're written however the manufacturer chooses. And then they represent an estimate to the peak quality of the product, so that the manufacturer knows if you open this product by this date, we're pretty darn sure that it is going to be the quality that we deem top notch for you to consume. That's well and good, but there's typically lots of time after that best before date that the product could be consumed. And that's really important. It's one of the biggest sources of food waste in Canada, is that food is thrown out just because it hits the best before date. And really, really important to highlight here is that a best before date is not a food safety indicator. It's simply a manufacturer's quality date that they deem acceptable, or they deem best for their product, not even acceptable. And it does not mean that the food is unsafe to eat after. As I mentioned, most likely the food is very safe to eat after, especially if you've handled it properly. If it's, perishable food, you've kept it in the fridge and out of that temperature danger zone. So we say then, well, what is an expiry date? Often people think, oh, meat has an expiry date or eggs has an expiry date. They don't actually. That will come as a huge surprise to you. So even meat and eggs, dairy, it can be eaten past the best before date if it's handled properly. You're of course going to use your senses to decide whether you think that food is edible, and you're going to say if it's been 10 weeks and it's milk, you're probably not going to eat it. But if it's been a few days and it doesn't smell funny, absolutely you can eat that. So what foods do expire in Canada? To be honest, they're pretty much all nutritional foods. And this is because expiry dates are a way of saying the nutritional value of this product will have degraded, because nutrients, vitamins, and minerals, they degrade over time. And so because it's degraded, it's no longer safe to eat because it's not providing the nutritional value that we've guaranteed the product provides. So you can see here, very simple, all of the products that have expiry dates are nutrition-based. So we have nutritional supplements, liquid diets like Booster and Shore. We have baby formula. We have meal replacements. That would be like a Cliff Bar or something like that. And then we have pharmacist sold foods. So something that we probably don't come into contact with very often, but that's for very special diets and scenarios. So I like to highlight very quickly here our food donation guide. This is a best before timetable that we've created that helps to give you guys, all of our partners, both businesses and nonprofits, guidelines for when food should be donated by and when it could be eaten by. Now, it's not, of course, every instance is different. This is not a rule. This is a guideline, and it requires, of course, that food was handled and kept safely to ensure that the safety was met across. But if food's handled properly, we do suggest businesses, for example, here you can see dairy, they could donate dairy sort of on or before the best before date. And then you have about 2 weeks potentially after the best before date where that food is still good to eat. And these guidelines, we didn't make them up. They're based on requirements or documents from the Government of Canada and other public health resources across the country. So very important there. As I mentioned, food waste based on best before dates is a huge source of food. Best before date food waste is a big source of loss, and it's really unnecessary in our homes. We can save so much money at our organizations, but understanding also that it can be, it's a culture shift. Like we talked about food safety, best before date, also a big shift in culture for how we think about best before dates. And it can be very personal. Food is very personal. And there are some instances where that's not, what works for somebody, and that's completely up to them. But we just want to share the facts and really encourage folks to share that information with your organizations and the people that you work with, because it's really important to reduce food waste for our long term and for the sake of the even just budgets in our organizations and things like that. So we recommend, you'll have the guidelines. You can find them on our website that we created, and they will be available as a link in this presentation. Post those, print those, share them, and of course, share this information as well. So just a quick summary of all we learned. I promised 45 minutes, and I've gotten too excited and given you talked for a few extra, but as a reminder, these are the items that we went over. Our 4 steps: keeping it clean, keep food out of the temperature danger zone, prevent cross-contamination, and cook and cool food properly. And if that's what you take away from this, you'll be food safety pros in no time. So I mentioned that we have other resources available. Yes, this is a one-time webinar right now. Yes, it will be available afterwards on, you'll send it by email. We'll have it up on our YouTube channel. But there's so many other things that you can do. If you haven't received one yet, we are offering safe food handler codes where you can actually do that full training to get certified in food safety for free. Second Harvest is paying for these codes just this year. And they are first come, first serve, but we do have, I think, lots of opportunity left. So if you'd like one, you can email foodrescue@secondharvest.ca and we'll get back to you in about a week's time and send you that code. You do have to commit to fully completing the course because we are purchasing these courses and we can't reuse them. So I just ask that if you are interested, you just make sure you're committed to going through the course from start to finish. We also have our food safety e-learning that I mentioned. It's really cool. It's 15 minutes of interactive videos, questions, quizzes, and it's a great way to share food safety with the other folks at your organizations, your volunteers, whomever, even your clients, especially if you're, they may be looking for a job in the food sector or something like that, or, just want to skills upgrade. This is a training that anyone can do, and you just access it through our training portal. And of course, we have all of our print resources. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to us at any time. All the contact details, but across Canada here. Very quickly, we'll finish off with our very last poll, and then I will go through some questions there. So Emily, if you can start the poll when you're able, that would be fantastic. All right, poll is happening. Let us know if you feel like your food safety knowledge how your food safety knowledge is after this event. We'll give it about 35 seconds, just a few more here. And we really appreciate your feedback. Please be honest. It's really important to us to enhance what we do is knowing, knowing our network and what works for them and what doesn't, and what, learnings you had and potentially what recommendations you have. So even after this, feel free to let us know. I think we can end the poll now. And then I'll jump into some questions. So we did have a question here about what recommendations do we have if you have to leave your space and you can't air dry. I have to answer your question from a government requirement standpoint, and I would say some sort of disposable paper towel could be a very good option. Now, I hate to say that because I like to use reusable things, but according to food safety requirements, that would be a sort of next best option. Emily, did we have any other questions that you
We had so many wonderful questions, and I loved quickly responding to them as we went. But we had a couple about sanitizing that I wanted to make note of here. So there were a couple about bacteria multiplication on different types of foods. So is the multiplication that you showed standard on all foods or only on more high-risk items like meat? Will perishable foods grow bacteria at that rate?
It's an amazing question. You guys are totally getting it. You guys get it if that's the kind of question you're asking. Any bacteria like certain things. They like wet. They like protein and carbohydrates, so like meat, like beans. They love beans, rice, anything that has protein and carbs. And that's wet, and they like, a basic acidity, average acidity, not too acidic, not too basic. So, if you had something that was really, really lemon juice, it'd grow a little bit less fast. But ultimately, there is a list or a concept of these potentially hazardous foods, as we call them, which are all the foods that grow bacteria sort of at a consistent rate. And those are foods, as I mentioned, that have lots of water, are wet foods, not dry. have protein and carbs. They're all the things you typically think of: meat, dairy, eggs, soy, and prepared foods. And prepared foods is one that people forget a lot, especially even things like people forget, like vegetable trays or dips or things like that. Those are big for growing bacteria. Scientifically speaking, some will grow bacteria a little bit faster or less fast as well. It depends on the temperature in the room, and then as well the type of bacteria. So lots of factors to consider, and it gets scientific and complex, which is why we always like to give those sort of basic recommendations, is if the food falls in any of those 4 or 5 categories, that you're treating it as if it could be growing bacteria at any time.
That's amazing. We did have a couple folks also ask if there's going to be a certificate for attending this webinar.
That's a great question. There's not a certificate for attending this webinar, but there is a certificate for completing the e-learning module. So you're welcome. I said it's 10-15 minutes to complete that. It is fun. So you're welcome to do that, and you'll have a nice certificate there. But if you want the safe food handling certification that's recognized by the government, reach out to us, as I mentioned, for the safe food handler code, that you do the whole learning online and take that test.
Wonderful. A lot of folks also asked more NFP focused, not-for-profit focused questions about repackaging food and how best before versus expiry can be communicated clearly to their clients in a way that they'll also accept that food.
This is good. And this is probably one of the hardest things in the nonprofit sector, is managing and balancing sort of clients' expectations and about best before dates with, the science and the facts that the food is edible past the best before date. If you're looking to just track, I recommend, using maybe an online tool like Google Sheets, or even if you just have it posted at your establishment, a list of all the foods that you've packaged from larger packages and just the dates on them. If that's all you're looking to do is track. If you're looking to help your clients maybe better understand, we do have another e-learning that's specifically about best before dates and best before date labeling. And all of our e-learnings are open to anybody across the world. Anybody can do them. It's, again, 10 to 15 minute, and it's a great interactive tool. It's also just something in your programming you could do depending on the type of programs you offer. And that's one way to help. But it's just an ongoing conversation. And, it's not an overnight thing. It takes a lot of work to change sort of any of our adult understandings about things. And so that's where we try to have as many resources as possible. But of course, it's lots of work, and there may not be an overnight solution.
Definitely not. There was also a similar question about a best before date passing, but then cooking that with that food to distribute to clients. Does that make an impact on the best before or the expiry date?
It's a really good question and sort of a complex one, but best before date doesn't have anything to do with food safety. So, whereas cooking does. When you cook food, you're potentially killing any living bacteria, and you're restarting the clock for the bacteria, and you can then sort of have a few days with that prepared food. Whereas a best before date is simply just, does the manufacturer think that food is going to look good and feel good? So absolutely, you can cook with food past the best before date using your senses as always. Because it's a sort of an issue of manufacturer's quality versus food safety when you're cooking, sort of two different pieces there that can easily get mixed up. But I think the takeaway is that a best before date is not an indicator of food safety at all.
Right. And I see we are coming up to 2:30 right now. Should I keep going with questions? Because there are still a few more.
For those who have to jump off, no problem. But since there's lots of questions, why don't we try to answer a few more for anyone who does want to stay?
Wonderful. And I do see a couple people have raised their hands. If you do have more questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to those in good time. So we had a couple of questions about sanitizing. You mentioned that chlorine is a really good sanitizer and alluded to a few others. Somebody asked specifically about vinegar being used and what are the other sanitizing properties that you can use?
It's a great question. And I usually say, and I didn't this time, excuse me, I usually say to call out vinegar is not an approved sanitizer. It doesn't kill bacteria the way that these certified or approved sanitizers from Canada are. It's not to say in your home you can't use it. It's great. But what we do in our organizations is on behalf of all the clients and potential customers that we're serving, and therefore we need to operate based on Canada's legal requirements. And so I mentioned chlorine bleach as one of the chemical sanitizers. The other two is our iodine and quaternary ammonium, both things that aren't as of use, kind of more tricky to work with. Quats is kind of expensive. Iodine is yellow and it stains everything. So I always recommend bleach.
And should you be using gloved hands or bare hands when washing in your sanitizing sink?
Good question. You can totally do either, up to you. While you may have some bacteria on your hands, you are putting them in the sanitizer, so your hands will also be sanitized in that process. So totally up to you whether you use gloved hands in that process. Brings up an interesting point. A lot of people do tend to use gloves overall in food prep. It's not required at all. You're required to wash your hands. If you are using gloves, you have to change them out every single time you're changing any sort of item. If you're touching your hair or anything, you can't wash your gloves. You have to change them. So I always recommend just using your hands and washing them thoroughly.
That's awesome. And then a really great question here. Our concern is the transport of food to our contacts. Is there any key considerations that we should be aware of?
Yes, my favorite one, because this is what the food rescue app that we operate at Second Harvest is all about, is nonprofits picking up food. And so, yes, if you are picking up food, you are, and it's food that is that potentially hazardous food, as I mentioned, meat, dairy, eggs, and you're delivering it to clients. According to the Canadian laws, you have to transfer that food with outside of the temperature danger zone. So you either have to keep it hot or you have to keep it cold. You have to keep it above 60 degrees or below 4 degrees. Now we recognize that, there's all kinds of different sort of assets that we can access to do things like this or not. But the easiest way to do that is to just get a simple cooler bag and some ice packs and pack it all in. And, you can cooler bags, hopefully you can find some really affordable ones, and you have a few big ones and that can cover you for your transportation. If you have a bigger vehicle, you can start to get into things like there's such a thing as like an ice blanket or things like that, but that gets a little more complex, and we just recommend coolers. They're a very easy option.
I think a really good question to finish on would be, how can you determine how long past a best before date is still safe?
Yes, this is a great question. Well, the short answer is there's not a good answer for that, because it really depends on how the food was handled. But if you know the food was handled safely and was stored properly, you really can keep it based on those guidelines that we provided. But how you can know if it's safe is often just based on your senses and just your knowledge that it was stored properly. If you have no idea how it was stored and you think there's a chance it could have been like left out in a hot environment or something, if it is food that shouldn't be kept hot or warm, then absolutely, I would say it's best to maybe even best before date has nothing to do with that. You probably can't eat it overall. But if you know it was handled safely, then you can use our guidelines to check what our suggestions are for timing. Things like a condiment or something that's shelf stable, you have lots of time, months, versus something more like a dairy or eggs, we'd recommend a few weeks.
There are a few more questions here. I'm a little aware of the time. How do you feel, Veronica?
Let's do one more.
Okay. I had a good one over here. Let me just find it. Oh man, sorry. should have been a little bit more ready. Is there an official website to check food expiration codes when they have no date, just a code?
Ooh. If it has no date, just a code, it probably is because it doesn't have a best before date. Now I know I mentioned the question mentioned, or I see the question mentioned expiry dates. If it does, it wouldn't have an expiry date at all. In that case, it would just probably have a best before date. There is no official website. You bring up a key point that we have lots of issues with date labeling and challenges around the lack of standardization. But if you're not seeing a date on there, it's because there's no best before date. And there are lots of foods that don't actually require a best before date, things like candy and such. So you just may have found a food that doesn't have one. So thank you, Emily, for hosting the questions. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. I wish we could stay on. I know lots of people and folks have places to be, but if you have any more questions, you can reach out to Second Harvest anytime. I do really recommend that e-learning module, and we'll be sharing these slides so that you can access all of that information going forward. So thanks so much, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day, and hope your food safety culture is on track now at your organization.